Good morning. This is a session about play. That energy was just not enough. Good morning. And welcome. My name is Eric, and as someone who plays for a living, it is gratifying that the Institute and the Ideas Festival has this year put a whole track together about the idea of play and treating it with some importance. I know that the other things that are covered here seem more important to most people, politics and education. Those are certainly important issues, but I think that they cease to be so important if in grappling with them we lose our human capacity for joy, and play is a big part of that. And so I think it's appropriate, before I introduce Dr. Brown, that I do something playful with you. Believe it or not, I have the ability to transmit thoughts from my mind into the minds of other people and to receive thoughts that people are sending to me, and I'm going to try to prove that this morning. Now, I'm not psychic. I don't believe in that kind of nonsense. But under the right circumstances, I can create the very convincing illusion of psychic power. And to do this, I'm going to need someone to help me. And that person is going to be this gentleman right here. You do not have to come onto the stage. You'd be relieved to find out. But would you empty your lap and stand up? And I'm going to begin by telling you that your first name is Peter. You'd be surprised how many people that catches, actually. He's got a big name tag. It says Peter on it. You are Peter, or are you a guy sneaking in with Peter's tag? Hello, Peter. I'm Eric. Have you ever had your mind read? Not recently. Where are you from? Minneapolis. But that's not really a Minneapolis accent. And you've lived in Minneapolis how long? Do you believe in psychic powers? Good man. And yet, when you leave here, this is going to keep you awake at night, very likely. We'll make it very simple this morning. It's early for me. I don't know about you. I'm going to think of a number. I'll give you some parameters. It's going to be a 2-digit number, so a number from 10 to 99 inclusive. And I'm going to try to project that number from my mind into yours without saying it. Okay. Try and clear your mind. It's impossible to make your mind a blank. You hear that sometimes. Make your mind a blank, but you can't do that. So just let your mind kind of drift. Think about a blue sky and clouds drifting by. And when I snap my fingers, I want you to call out the first number that pops into your head. Are you ready? $47 is exactly the number I was projecting. Thank you very much. Now, here's the thing. This is that might work in some circumstances, but this is a very astute and probably scientific group, and with no evidence, really the method that everyone jumps to is, well, he's lying. I'm not lying. 47 was the number, and I'm going to try and prove it. Stand up again, Peter. And we're going to do it again, only this time I will commit myself in writing before I project the number. So, a little business card, a little pencil. I'll put a circle on here. There we go, a little circle. And let me get a number in mind. The only thing that I'll tell you is it will not be 47. But a number from 10 to 99 inclusive, 47 excluded. And it's going to be this. And I get rid of the pencil so I cannot go back and redact my work. Peter, don't look. I give a little peek to these people. Please don't say anything about that number. Same thing. Clear blue sky, clouds floating by in your mind. Kind of take a deep breath and relax just a little bit. And when I snap my fingers, the first number that pops into your head, 23. Does that number have some significance for you? Does it mean something to you? Would you care to tell us the reason, or are we just going to be left to guess what? Step around here. This is a fairly large room. Take the card from me, turn and face the audience in a loud, clear voice with your beautiful accent. Would you call out the number that I was trying to project? 3. It is 23. 23. You can keep that. Someday I'm going to be very famous. That could be worth like $8 on eBay. So, while you ponder that little mystery of the mind, we're now going to turn our attention to the mind and the idea of play, and specifically the neuroscience of play. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Stuart Brown. Doctor? Have fun.
Thank God for Eric. You know, I'm going to talk about play, where play is an experience. So it's always a problem, because when you talk about play, it's kind of like shooting down a bird of paradise in flight and dissecting it. So with that caveat, let's get rolling. I happen to think that this is a very true statement in our culture right now, that if we add some science to what is the actuality of play, many transformations will take place. However, there is a certain problem with play, in that when you get to serious people and you ask them for funding, or you begin to talk to them about what they really think is important in their lives, they have this attitude that was prevalent prior to a shift in public health attitude about smoking. And I think play, to some degree, in the mainstream, not with this group of pro-play advocates that's in this audience, but I think the state of play PR is a little bit like it was cool to smoke 50 years ago. And I hope in the course of our time here, we can shift that perception somewhat. This is a publicized and well-publicized sequence, but I think it's worth going over for us again. On the stage left is a wild male polar bear. A few seconds before this picture was snapped by Norbert Rossing, who's a German photographer who was doing a sequence for a German magazine on these tethered sled dogs. This polar bear was headed toward this foreground female sled dog with a predatory gait. If any of you have ever been chased by a junkyard dog or seen predators in action in Africa, you know that there's a very specific goal-directed, rigid, stereotype behavior which should have produced terror on the part of this sled dog. But they started exchanging signals. If you'll notice, the sled dog's mouth is open and no fangs, and the bear's fur is flat, the ears are back, the eyes are soft, and they begin to engage in a series of remarkable events. They begin a mutual ballet of play, so that the play signals that they have exchanged with each other have overridden what should have been terror and a fight to the death on the part of the sled dog and a good meal for the part of the carnivorous polar bear, became this remarkable sequence of events. And there they're using what the animal play behavior is called a play bite, which we've all had happen with our dogs and kitties, where if they had wanted to have a full measure of rage and carnivorous activity, would have been lethal. And so they keep this up. And you see here the two of them locked with the sled dog's throat open to the fangs of the polar bear, and they are in an altered state of being. That altered state of being is a state of play, which we as social mammals all have the capacity to achieve if we allow ourselves. And it opens them up to exploring the unexpected. I always love this image because it shows handicapping. It shows a creature of great power, limiting that power and allowing a union of heart and mind to come together. And again, as this sequence ends, there is an exchange of eye contact and a softness and an alteration that comes right out of nature. These two kept this up for 2 weeks, and then the bear went off to on the ice in Hudson Bay, where this sequence was photographed, and became a carnivore and did what polar bears do in the winter, which is decapitate seals as they stick their heads up through the ice in order to survive. But this is a different matter, and this is a prototype of play. Think about what they're doing here. They're doing something entirely new. They are doing something entirely unexpected and capricious. It is non-stereotyped. It is random. It is really the exploration of the possible, which is part of what play does. It allows the exploration of the possible. Now, for those of you who have a need for a big picture, I would like to at least give a sweeping context for how I would like us all to begin to think about play, and that is to start at 13 billion years ago at the Big Bang, realize that Galileo and Hubble have produced the opportunity for us to see the cosmos in a different way, as has the Fermi Lab, which has, and within the Hubble system, has allowed us to see our galaxy as a creative kind of dynamic process. The Fermi Lab has been able to, along with CERN and others, to go to the ultra small. We've got the ultra large in cosmology, the ultra small in subatomic particles, and within that, great mystery. But within that mystery, there are certain principles such as interconnectedness, creativity, and the ability to take chaos and out of chaos find order. And the reason I put this here is I think in part as you see play in its broadest context, it does that. It can take what we saw with the polar bear and the sled dog, take something that was once one thing and make it into something else. Here's our Earth, and here is a cell membrane. And the reason I put this up is that life separates itself into something very special. It's separate from the rest of the cosmos, but it is interconnected. And as we see that there is DNA, our master molecule, throughout all of life, these components are things at least the neuroscientists that I know who are now studying play in some detail pay attention to. So this, one of my PhD students at Stanford made this, got a summa cum laude pass on his PhD, but we're looking at play in the context that it has evolved. And indeed it has evolved. This is our earliest form of a brain, and our ancient relative, the sea squirt larva, has a rudimentary backbone. And in its larval form, it swims back and forth in the sea and is able to discern between something that's nutrient and something that is toxic. That's a rudimentary brain, and it is able to use that brain to its own ends. However, when a sea squirt larva becomes an adult, and I'm looking around to see if there are any adult prototypes of this sea squirt adult, it attaches itself to a rock and auto-digests its brain. I mentioned Stanford. There are a few tenured professors who fit this this model. No names, no personalities. And this is the cute koala. This is a kind of an example of use it or lose it. The koala has a very large cranium. And in doing some brain imaging through the National Institute for Play, we've been able to discern that certain couch potato types also have a loss of brain substance like the koala. The koala can forage at will, doesn't have to use much initiative, gets a eucalyptus leaf anytime it wants, and its brain is about the size of Homer Simpson's. Now, what is it in nature that allowed creatures like these birds, which have been around for, I guess, 300 million years, to engage in this absolutely beautiful swirl of play? And I would say that driving down from Independence Pass the other day, I saw a couple of ravens doing this same sort of thing. Beautiful, seemingly purposeless activity that comes right out of nature. Well, we have been around less long than those birds in terms of evolution, but we have this massive cortex which is not always put to good use. I think the story of play is a story of how really to put the cortex to its very best use. And I hope by the time we're done with this, some of you may be convinced of this. Our hunter-gatherer heritage is the essence of what our bodies are. I read yesterday's paper. It said that they'd found some flint and some other artifacts in England which were 800,000 years old, and that the assumption was that there was a hunter-gatherer civilization in England, in the United Kingdom, 800,000 years ago. We have the body of a hunter-gatherer, and our nutrition and exercise needs, and in many instances our cognitive needs, are based on this hunter-gatherer model. Peter Gray has written beautifully about the survival of the hunter-gatherer groups, those who've been studied most intensely over the last 150 years, survived because they essentially incorporated play into the dynamic of their civilization. And that makes sense to me, certainly as I've looked at play through my lifetime. Now, living around Aspen and living in Southern California, there are certain elements of the hunter-gatherer ethic that may not be in the best needs, for the best needs of our planet. This is a hand axe that's 400,000 years old. It's too big to be used for purposes of slicing up our prey. But I put it here because I like the idea it gives me, which is that divinely superfluous neurons existed many, many moons ago and enabled art and play to take place. But where does play begin? Well, I like to think, and certainly have found, that it begins with this bonding mother, infant, parent-child process, which we see with the eye gaze that's going on between these primates, and which we see beautifully as the radiant smile of the baby and the smile of the mother as they lock eyes evokes something we've all seen, which is a radiant, luminous sense of joy. Spontaneous, and the mother begins to go nuts and make her baby sounds. The baby blows bubbles with spit, and pretty soon there's a nonsense going between them. This is the grounding base of play behavior. It's hardwired, and it's being studied in some centers, particularly Alan Shore at UCLA. We've got a small study going in Chicago on this, in which we're able to put a 256 lead EEG on this infant, unsuspecting as to what's going on, and same thing with the infant's mother. And we come up with some surprising findings when this radiant smile, eye contact, locking on occurs. The right cortex of the infant and the right cortex of the mother at that moment of joy are in attunement. They're in harmony. There's an electroencephalographic reading which says these things are happening in sequence. And as Alan has studied, when there has been severe deprivation on the part of the child or the mother, and the mother is psychotic or the infant is unable to respond, this attunement process does not take place with the eye contact. And Alan writes that this is the base of emotional regulation. The right cortex grows faster. It is where intuition and other very necessary forms of behavior begin to take shape. And part of what I think, going to show to you today is that this bonding process, this joyful process, this play process needs to be reinforced throughout the life cycle. And this is kind of the beginning point of it. This is an example, a schematic of synaptogenesis, new connections being made, and this, of course, Alan has demonstrated, and animal play behaviorists have demonstrated a great deal of nourishment that comes to the brain through early play. We respond to this. Now, this is not a mall in contemporary Monterey near where I live. This is a 16th century courtyard that Peter Bruegel painted, and I believe there are 124 different kinds of play activities taking place here. And as we close up on this, begin to see something that's quite remarkable. There are hijinks, physical activity, games of all sorts, even contemplative play, rough and tumble play, and I don't see much of this going on in the malls that I visit these days. And I think we've lost something. And a few years back, I was interviewed for this article that came out in the New York Times. Really was a very good article. It was an uphill struggle because I think the contemporary feeling of the author was that play is trivial. And when the article came out, it left something really, really significant out. Take a look at this. Do you see any adults? None. So that's the sort of the stereotype of what play is. It's for kids. Well, it's not. We're designed to play through our lifetime. And when we begin to look at play and dissect it into its various parts, this is body play. Anybody who is feeling really sort of down and hungover this morning, I don't care if you get up and start jumping around. Imagine that you're in one of these buckets with this little girl, and you'll have a good time. And you see play with body play throughout the animal world. This mountain goat is jumping, twisting, and turning, and by all we can discern, appears to be having a very good time. And I took this shot in the Serengeti when I was doing some work for the National Geographic because I really liked the idea that this young hippo was doing a backflip. Now, if you take, at the time I took this picture, which is 15, 16 years ago, you go to a biologist and they try and say, well, this has to have some purpose. There must be lice on the back or something like that. Well, not so. I think this is done for its own sake. It appears purposeless, part of the definition of play. And if you were to wire up this hippo, I wouldn't advise you doing this in the wild, and take a look at what was going on in that hippo's cerebellum. At this age, the cerebellum would be firing all kinds of impulses into the prefrontal cortex of that hippo, making it smarter. Now, this is an example that part of what David Rockwell mentioned yesterday morning in that elegant interview was that risk is a part of play. Now, I think this young man probably knows that the pile of leaves are going to break his fall, but look at his face. And think about the sled dog and the polar bear and the state of play and the last time you yourself were in this state. Really important to get there regularly. Now, I put this in because I think that this tongue being out right here, this is an orang hanging upside down, splashing in the water. A larger picture will show that it was making itself a pendulum. But I like this because I remember Michael Jordan driving for the basket in the NBA Finals with his tongue right there. He was in the zone. Well, I think this orang is in the zone. And you begin to see, when you study animal and human play, you begin to see patterns, which this for me would not be play, this would be terror. But for some, it's fun. And I mentioned the cerebellum. The reason I mention this is that three-dimensional gravitational pull outside in nature does good things for the brain and is a part of the natural process of play. And I don't think if I was sitting here just staring at this screen and manipulating the keys, it would necessarily be the same. Now, I did mention risk. I mentioned risk. There is a sense of common sense that if you're a parent, you really don't say, "Go at it, boy." You stop him and do a little common sense supervision. Object play, inherent in the smart mammals, and the more the mammal is smart, this is a dolphin creating the earliest toy. Object play. Object play. They roll the snowballs down the hill. Object play. One of Jane Goodall's chimpanzees playing with a stem which becomes a tool for survival through eating termites. I'm not so sure. Your call on this one. Now, Frank Wilson is an advisor to the National Institute for Play, and I have learned an immense amount from Frank and from one of his best friends, Nate Jones, who is a master mechanic. And so I'll tell you a little story about them. Nate had been teaching auto shop and auto repair in Long Beach High School for many years. He has a shop of his own that's been renowned, and Indy 500 racers and so on have come to him for years. But he was concerned as he was watching the historical time pass that kids were not able to fix cars. They didn't get it. They didn't get some of the necessities to fix cars. And he talked to his wife about this, who was an elementary school teacher, and she was saying, "I'm noticing some of the same things in the class. And so he said, "I'm going to write a book about this." And at about that time, he came across this book by Frank. And he asked his daughter to find Frank because he was not computer literate enough to find Frank on the internet. He found him. They got together. They wrote an article for the Long Beach paper on the importance of hand-brain coevolution and the importance of using your hands. And one of the HR people at JPL and NASA picked this up and said, "I'm having trouble hiring really good R&D replacements for my master problem solvers. And even though they've got a Caltech degree and a Harvard degree and they've got the best academic credentials you can imagine, they're not good problem solvers." And so he dug back into the HR records and found that his best problem solvers were tinkerers, had used their hands in youth. And he has, as has Boeing and some other organizations now, incorporated that as a part of their hiring process, that tinkering in youth is not only good for problem solving in an R&D engineering capacity, but also has some payoff for three-dimensional metaphoric problem solving in and of itself. We are hands in search of a brain, brains in search of a hand. And it was great to see the kids playing with the blocks and to see the blocks in that adventure playground yesterday. Perfect kind of training ground for I think, building a more playfully elegant brain. This young leopard had never seen this tortoise. So at first, it approached this tortoise with trepidation. Once the tortoise sucked his head in, this became a toy. Not the tortoise didn't enjoy it particularly, but the leopard had a really good time. And this, I think, is a prototype of curiosity and exploration as parts of being a player. This young man is doing some anatomic exploration of his mother. And this young lady, look at this look on her face. This is a series of objects that had been created which she had never seen, which were random. Now, can you imagine what she's making in her own mind's eye of this absolutely new experience? And those of you who have children know that virtually every time they go outside as they're growing up, every day is a new experience. How about us? We should look with the same wonder at the world. The day's like no other. I mean, I walked out this morning and headed over to the swimming pool so I'd be halfway awake when I got here, and it was glorious, a new day. Well, curiosity and play go together. And pretend and real. This is a young man pretending to be whoever he wishes to be. Aquanaut, Superman, he is at that moment who he wishes to be. The pretend real dialogue does not stop in youth. Do we know what we're going to listen to this afternoon? Well, some of us have some idea about it. That's pretend. And since I'm a psychiatrist and spend a lot of time listening to people, about half of what goes on is pretend and half is real. And that dialogue continues, and it's a rich dialogue, and it's playful in its origins, particularly if we're going to be creative and come up with innovation and some new ideas. I love that picture. Almost as much as I love this picture, because this is of my daughter who now lives in Boulder, and we had just engaged in an imaginative storytelling episode in a little arroyo not far from San Diego called Fat Man's Misery in Torrey Pines Park. So this brings back a lot of rich memories, and this is her son, whose real name is Leo Sundstrom, but when you ask him who he is, particularly after watching the French Grand Prix a couple of years ago and going out into the street, he is Lance Armstrong. He may think that's his name, so he becomes, through his imagination, he actually becomes another person for that moment. And that transformation is magical, necessary, biologically based as far as I'm concerned, and important. And here is another part of the developmental sequencing that I think play offers. Here is a picture of Heidi from the book Heidi. After she's had some very difficult times, she's come back to the protective care of her grandfather, and as she's in the loft, she is free to fantasize, to come up with reverie. And here are some kids, and I think we've all done some of this, making their own fort and creating their own world. This pretend real world is such a resource that we really need to honor and not necessarily thwart with our educational system or with everything having to be purposeful. I'm going to talk about social play for a while because there's a natural history trajectory of social play, which begins early, where the parents, when they're watching these two, these two young ladies, assume that they're real buddies, but they're not. They're really just sort of halfway together, walking around. And it reminds me of going to a pub and engaging in small talk. That adult small talk and parallel play are kind of alike, so that there is this way of getting into a social process that play enhances. And it moves along. They become more involved in the course of play, and pretty soon they have a sense of belonging. The essence of community is established through these regular, developmentally appropriate opportunities driven from within the child themselves through their play nature and play instinct, which creates some of those things that we long for in adulthood, which is a workable community. Example of that, again, with these multi-gender playful things. Now, if I had one image that I could just use and talk about play from, this would be it. I saw these two lionesses lying quietly at dawn, looking full of torpor, looking like they're going to sleep all day, suddenly jump up and begin from a distance which looked like a fight. But it's not a fight. If you go back to the polar bear husky paradigm or sled dog paradigm, soft eyes, no fangs, no claws, curvilinear movements, ballet-like activity. This is a specific form of play called play fighting or rough and tumble play. It's seen in all highly social mammals, and the interchange that goes on between them during this is huge information exchange. Who am I? Am I fast? Am I slow? Am I tough? Am I dominant? Am I non-dominant? And this is done at no great expense or risk to the creatures who are engaged in it. And here's kind of an example of rough and tumble play in kids. One kid's getting pinned, but he's smiling. They smile at each other. This is a form of play that appears to adults who have forgotten about it to be anarchy and to be mayhem. It's noisy, and yet it's tremendously significant developmentally. This is taken in Aspen during the mud seasons, which, as you know, anyone with a trust fund here gets out of town, but the rest of us who have had to live in Colorado during mud season engage in rough and tumble play. Becomes a more sophisticated in its formats, but it is tremendously important because as we get to a little farther along in this play dialogue, I will talk to you about murderers who didn't engage in rough and tumble play. Now, bullying is not play. Domination is not play. It may produce some pleasure on the part of the dominator, but it is really not play. Play is a state of being and separate from all others, and I think this can often get confused. I like rats behind bars, and I'll tell you why. We've learned huge amounts about play from the rat play researchers. Rats at the age of 4 weeks begin to engage in rough and tumble play. They nuzzle each other, they start pinning each other, they're very active. When you see this, it's fun to watch them, watch a laboratory rat doing this. And it's a natural phenomenon. It tails off a little about 15 weeks when they get more interested in mating, but it's a very necessary part of their background. And Serge Pellis, who's a Canadian investigator, has spent 30 years studying rat rough and tumble play. And when he stops this in the laboratory and interdicts rough and tumble play and systematically does not allow it to occur between 4 and 15 weeks, and then allows the rat to grow up without it, what do you think happens to the rat? Well, they're not going to do very well in life. They can't tell the butt from the head if they try to mate. They can't tell friend from foe. If you bring a cat odor-laden collar and present that to these rough and tumble deprived rats, they flee like crazy. All rats do. They're hardwired to flee at cat odor. Their cortisol level goes up. They're stressed immensely, as would a normal rat be. But their stress level stays up. Instead of recovering from the stress of the cat odor, they stay with PTSD. And a lot of them don't survive, strictly with the absence of rough and tumble play. But where does this rough and tumble play come from, and what does it do? Well, another rat investigator, Jacques Panksepp, who has done a lot more work on studying play than goes beyond rats, but he, in his laboratory, took the cortex off infantile rats, surgically removed it. Rats can survive, so can all social mammals early, with the removal of a cortex. Well, you'd think highly intricate behavior like rough and tumble play, which is really quite intricate as we saw with the lionesses, you'd think it wouldn't happen. At 4 weeks, the decorticated rats who have healed engage in normal rough and tumble play. What does this mean? It means that the origin of play impulses in all of us social mammals comes from the most ancient survival centers of the brain, from our brainstem. So play is a survival drive, if what these laboratory folks say is correct, and I believe it. I believe they're right on because the data is accumulating rapidly. Well, I could spend the rest of the time talking about rats, but I won't. Anyhow, these are the two brainstems, the rat brainstem here and the human brainstem, and they are remarkably similar architecturally. The neurotransmitters are the same, and much of the basic architecture, which goes all the way back to our reptilian evolutionary heritage, is virtually identical. So the origins of play behavior appear to be tied in very clearly with survival. Now, lest you think we don't need our cortex, we do. But what happens with the these play impulses that emanate from this portion of the brain is that they go up to the cortex, particularly the prefrontal cortex. They are modified, and memory traces and maps occur, particularly developmentally, during these crucial periods of play behavior. So this is where you begin to think, wait a minute, how can we call play trivial? And it has a lot to do with effective contextual memory and things which I think the neuroscientists in the next decade are going to tell us a great deal more about. Games, next subject. Games are found in the animal world, and play and games go together. This is just an example of Ring Around the Rosie that requires early cooperation. Games and competition are normal. Winning at all costs, dominating at all costs. We all know there's a legacy of sports that is not particularly good for a lot of the kids who drop out and don't continue, and National Institute for Play and some others have done some work to try and alter that. But games and competition are a normal part of the trajectory of play. And this is a fact that we've got now some really good co-ed play going on. I lived fairly near UCSD, and it was over a period of 25 years, and it was really fun to watch the games change and to see ultimate frisbee and other kinds of co-ed games occurring, which are terrific. Celebratory play. Who won? Well, part of play and the outcome of play is celebration. I'm giving you, social play, body play, celebratory play. So we're giving you a taxonomy of play, which may never be seen again in Boston, but this was the moment of the winning of the World Series. Both the spectators and the players are in a state of play. Ritual play, tossing of the hats. I think some of what we're doing here and what's being established in the Aspen Ideas Festival may in part be a marvelous ritual of play. At least I'm experiencing it that way here. The India Festival of Colors. So you see these ritual and festivals of play that go very, very deep and are part of the human schemata. The Black Mardi Gras. A couple hundred years of very intricate ritual play. These costumes are absolutely gorgeous. And this has not been very well publicized, but there's been a Black Mardi Gras that's been parallel and has its own energy. It's a part of ritual play. And if you are living in the West and at the end of August want to go out to the Black Rock Desert with 48,000 other people and enjoy an immense Saturnalia where the rules are turned upside down and at the end of which the burning man is burnt, that's ritual play and very important to many, many people. So ritual play is an important part of play. And so is aesthetic play. I don't know what's going on in the mind's eye of this dolphin, but I'll bet it's not too different than when I walked to the athletic club this morning at sunrise. There's an aesthetic component to play. There's a kind of a elegance and form that is beautiful and that play nourishes. So this is part of what you begin to sense that goes on in this whole process of play, which is separate. Narrative play. I love this shot because it's so timeless. This bushman caught a minnow and is about to make it into a 4-foot-long fish. And the enchantment of the audience is great. Brian Sutton Smith has done some studies of what kids really like to do when they play, and he's been doing this really since the late 40s, beginning in New Zealand, right to the present moment. And what surprised me from some of his work is I'm a father of 4 kids, and I always thought playing ball, going hiking, doing something active was what was necessary to be playful as a dad. Well, what he's shown from studying the kids is that the kids themselves love storytelling. They love this narrative process. And when you look at the inner life of kids and their internal narratives, a lot of their sense of reality comes from their own internal storytelling, which is at its core and can be at its core a very playful process. The languages of play. what's going to happen to you after this signal is given? You're going to play. This is an icon of trust. Pre-verbal. Play signals, you know that this dog is not going to harm you. So this is part of the process of this natural history of play, which is so phenomenal when you begin to look at it, that there are all these signals. Play face, same thing with these fox kids. Play chase. Now here are two creatures, a vervet monkey, and I forget, it's a bustard, I think, in Africa. And this vervet on my right is chasing the vervet on the left, who's chasing this bird. Now what happened is the bird got the signals, took flight, and started chasing the vervet, and they reversed. So this is a play signal that crosses species lines and crosses hundreds of millions of years and is still interpretable as something very fundamental in nature. In this instance, the play chase is basic. The chaser becomes the chasee. Handicapping, they allow the game to continue. That's part of the natural history of play. And the ability to, as we've seen with the polar bear and the sled dog, to cross over what otherwise are huge differences is necessary. Now, I really have to stop here and say that I want to give a little obeisance to the national history of play and one of our board of directors doing something very serious, which is Jane Goodall having a play conversation with one of her favorite chimps. But I put this up because they're vocal signals that signal play, and they're even olfactory ones that signal play for aquatic creatures. Well, we're getting into part of the title, what is not play and what happens when you don't. You know, this may be play for the spectators, but I'm not sure it is for those guys. And I haven't figured out whether McEnroe is playing with us or really is pissed off here. But that's not play. And I live near Pebble Beach, and that guy paid $500 for a round of golf, and that's not play. But I'm going to take you now into how I got started in this wonderful exploration. This is a picture of Charles Whitman. On August 1st, 1966, Charles Whitman killed his wife of 2 years early in the morning, and his mother, who was residing in Austin, Texas, took an armory of guns into the Texas Tower, and proceeded to kill 14 people and wound 41. I had finished my second residency that day on August 1st, and I was moving my office from one place to another at Baylor College of Medicine to become an assistant professor of psychiatry when the dean came by with a portable radio. I could hear gunshots, and he said, "Why don't you psychiatrists do something about this?" And I began to hear live the actual event, which lasted about 2.5 hours on the Texas Tower. And I thought to myself, probably some deranged schizophrenic delusional up there, you know, who knows, but probably a psychotic. About 2.5 hours later, I got a call from my boss who was in Spain, and on the line was John Connolly, who was the governor of Texas at that time, who had been in the Kennedy motorcade, had himself received a gunshot wound that went through his chest and into his wrist. And Sherv Fraser, who was my boss, said, "Stu, you did a little work in violence. Would you run the investigation? John Connolly wants to know why this young man, Charles Whitman, did what he did." Whitman had been killed in vigilante and police crossfire after this 2.5 hour episode on the tower. And so, with unlimited funds, couldn't happen now, I guess, and along with a lot of help, I organized a team, and we looked into every aspect as to why Charles Whitman did what he did. He had been an Eagle Scout. He'd been an altar boy. He was an architectural engineering student. He'd been an NROTC scholarship recipient. He'd been in the United States Marines. We knew he was a crack shot in that the first victim he killed off the tower was 343 yards away, and he put a bullet through the left ventricle. So he was an incredible shot. Anyhow, I walked up into this tower. There was still clotted blood because he'd killed members of the family in there, and began this odyssey of trying to figure out what went on. And what we did, particularly through the help of a child psychiatrist, was go back to the earliest possible aspects of his developmental life. And there was a rich mother lode of information. He grew up in Florida, and we had records from the prenatal visits with his doctor. His mother, for example, had her skull fractured by an abusive father when she was 4.5 months pregnant with Charlie. I could go on and on. There was abuse, but the father was absolutely overbearing. He had been orphaned, swore that when he had this very bright, very capable son, that his son would never go through what he went through, so he controlled every aspect of his life beyond measure. I've taken 6,000 play histories since then, and this is certainly the most oppressive one that I've ever taken. So we came out of this study with a recognition, yes, there'd been abuse and a lot of stress, but that the absence of play behavior selectively through his lifespan had left him without a repertoire of behaviors to handle high stress, particularly humiliation and depression. And this was not well integrated at that point into my whole thinking, but this was certainly a major part of the commission's report to the governor. Well, being a young professor, I got a grant to then study young murderers and felony drunken drivers in the state of Texas for a couple of years. And I really didn't expect anything similar to come out of those studies as it happened with Whitman, because Whitman was the largest mass murderer in the United States at the time. The times were tremendously turbulent. This was not too long after the Kennedy assassination. Oswald had been killed. I mean, these were difficult times, and we somehow thought our teams, research teams, although we paid attention to play, did not expect it to come out of the woodwork like it did. And yet the differences between our control populations and comparison populations and those young men who had committed homicide and those felony drunken drivers who'd either been killed or killed someone else were vastly different. The play histories of the murderers and the felony drunken drivers were replete with no rough and tumble play, no pets to speak of, no birthday parties, just a panorama of play deficiencies or play aberrations, a lot of abuse, a lot of other things that led to the decision to kill someone. Not everybody who's play deprived is going to become a murderer. I mean, that should be clear to all of us. But there is this trajectory of play deprivation which has huge consequences. So you can tell I'm a pretty old guy, so I've been doing this play, looking at play for a long time. So throughout my clinical career, I left academic medicine, went to San Diego, did administrative and academic medicine there and a private practice, but took 6,000 play histories. And what you find is, although the mass murderers on this end and the Nobel laureates are and the really fun, successful people are on this end, everybody's affected by how much and the quality of their play developmentally and personally. So that's sort of the serious side of the Texas Tower and its outcomes. And I want you to imagine what it is to live in a world without play. Empathy is developed in the process. Use parallel play, rough and tumble play, games, competition. The ability to know how to take your lumps and not give them back is part of the play process. Rigidity. One of the things play does is allow humor and other forms of playfulness to keep you from being fixed in a very specific, moralistic, value, rigid system. Interpersonal conflicts are lessened by playful spirit. And we all know what it is to feel joyless. Play produces, even in the worst circumstances, a sense of joy. I talked to Sebastian Junger at dinner the other night, who's done the book on war, talking about the bonding and joyfulness even in the most difficult circumstances in Afghanistan. We need joyfulness. predilection to addiction. If you have to have an escape, and you have to have a hedonic, escapist way to cope, addictions are really much more common in the play-deprived. Diminished curiosity. Begin to think about what we need to survive in our culture. We need curiosity and workaholism. That's a form of obsessive rigidity. And at the core, I think, of a world without play is a smoldering depression. The opposite of play is not work. It's depression. I mean, to me, play and work need to be integrated. They don't need to be separate. So, this is David, who came to the United States, got infused with the work ethic, and that's how he went home. Obese. So if you think about activity and obesity, I put this in because there are some antidotes to a lot of things that are going on in our culture that I think play can help. All right. Neoteny. Oh, would I like to spend an hour on this one. This is such fun. You see this Labrador? We love Labrador puppies. They play. They're great. And here are two wolf puppies. And if you notice, short muzzle, ears are not up, ears are down. They have a certain configuration. Well, if you watch these wolf puppies grow up, they look like labs, and at a certain point, they do nothing but play. However, if you watch the lab grow up, what happens? The lab stays playful, dies of old age, playful. That means the lab is neotenous. It preserves an immature kind of gestalt. Whereas this wolf gets a long muzzle, ears are upright, becomes alpha or subservient, still capable of play, but not nearly as playful. The wolf is not as neotenous as the lab. Now, I want you to make a big jump and think of yourself as a primate, period. Where do we, in the primate line, where are human beings? Well, are we here, which is an adult chimp with 98.5% of our genes, looking somewhat different and not very playful? Or are we here, this playful mother, look at her configuration of her cranium, look at the configuration of the juvenile cranium of the chimp, look at the configuration, if we had it on the slide, of the baby, and you'll see differences. And the differences are that as the maturity occurs in the chimpanzee, they have a different kind of overall gestalt, and they lose a lot of the flexibility and the juvenility of both their nervous system and their physical appearance, and of course their behavior. Whereas a human being, by biological design, is more like this than like this. And that has immense consequences for the retention of flexibility, for the necessity for playfulness through the life cycle, and for us to design our education, from my standpoint, education and our institutions to incorporate playfulness so we at least fit our bloody design. And there's a lot of good science that's now coming out of this. So this is the sort of thing that inspires me to keep doing what I'm doing at this ancient age instead of trying to beat Jim Philpott in tennis. So we're capable of play through a lifetime. We are neotenous. I think I'll just leave this on for a while. Imprint on it. And seasoned words, and the final will be this film clip.
For Beau and White, the most profound moments of the trip came from a visit to an orphanage nursery. Here, 40 infants were lying two to a bed, including 6-month-old Cara.
It's a gift to me. It's a gift to myself to be here with Karen. I mean, I'm selfish enough to own what I need, and I need this kind of connection. And you don't have to come to San Salvador to do this.
Patch Adams has come to realize that, at the heart of the matter, there is play and love. They both connect us at the deepest level.
We are taking play in our clowning in a much more traditional sense of play. Loud noise, gay abandon, laughing frivolity. But it's incorrect to think that play doesn't have a silent component. Take the child that was in the hospital today. I didn't ask what her problem was, but play made it possible for me to go up and be with her. And there was her father and her. For me, that's play. I am using play to go to the worst possible moment. Play is a connector. Play and love address alienation like a frontal attack.
I don't have to come here to be fully alive. But when you're around people that are suffering, one of the things suffering does, it evokes something in you. You get your heart broken open, and then you see what's inside. I think if we started valuing play more, then what we would probably do would be, we'd be paying attention in new ways, with beginner's mind, with the eyes of the child, and see options and possibilities to solve some of the enormous problems that we have. I don't think play is done to the exclusion of ignoring the pain and suffering and unfairness of the world. I think play may help us better deal with it, actually.
Thank you very much. If there's time, I'm happy to take questions, but I don't know whether we got to bail out of here since I'm a bit over time. Yes.
Hi, Judy from Aspen. When my kids were growing up, two boys, they're in their 30s, they played, they lost their games. Some of my younger friends now have kids who are playing baseball and soccer, and nobody's allowed to lose anymore. What happens then?
I don't know that we know exactly what happens, but we do know that there are consequences if self-organized activity, which is play behavior, is dominated by adults or by the expectations other than what come from within the child. This is where pickup games in the past, where you had to make your own rules and figure out your own team, and winning and losing was modified, worked. I don't know that we know, other than I think there is a lack of initiative and autonomy that occurs in kids who are constantly monitored by adults or who are looking to adults and to the culture to improve their resume so they can get into Stanford. You know.
Have you studied twins who have lost early in life?
Not specifically. I've had some private patients that have had that experience, but I haven't done any systematic studies. So, but why don't you? You may have some thoughts on that.
I lost my sister died at age 5. Where, you know, what you think might. I'm sorry. I'm just curious what you thought might have happened to the surviving child.
Well, identical twins often have a mirror image inside themselves of each other.
And they were not.
But what happens in the instance that I'm thinking of clinically is the development of an imaginary playmate, which is a very, very reparative kind of experience that can compensate for the loss. And kids are very, very resilient if they're otherwise safe and well fed. They deal with the grief and work it through often in play processes, but survive often very well, even though, I mean, the natural history of our species is we've lost siblings and parents throughout history. So we've got to be able to cope with it. Thank you.
Dr. Brown, could you talk a little bit, or I'm assuming that play develops into creativity for people like myself in the arts who were always told to be logical or to grow up and we didn't want to do it. Is that how we became creative?
By following the rules and...
Oh, by not.
No, I think that the random, non-stereotype quality of being a player, being open to something that comes from within yourself, and being aware of your own internal natural play personality. I didn't get into that in the talk. The book talks about this, where our innate talents are often revealed to us through our play behavior as little kids. And one of the things I do when someone says, I've lost my ability to play, is to take them back into their earliest kind of memory where they know they were joyful, and let them build on that. And most artists that I know don't lose that. They stay attached to that joyful play activity. Mike, somebody will need a mic, I guess.
My name is Gunnar Sachs from Aspen, and my question is, have you done any research on parents, or when somebody becomes a parent? I think there's a resurgence of play as an adult, and what kind of effects that has. And my second question is, do you know of any book or any piece of literature that kind of shows the map of play and the growth within a child? I just became a father 20 months ago, and for me it's the best experience in the world, and I definitely see myself playing a lot more than I did 22 months ago.
No, so you're answering your question. The best way to regain your play nature is to be around kids, and they're masters at it. They come at it naturally. It does reignite play and play memories in parents who allow it. What is often sad, however, is the parent feeling they can't really allow the kind of anarchy that I showed in rough and tumble play because it makes them uncomfortable. They've lost that for themselves, and yet that kind of freedom to allow those developmental processes to occur, and to have preschool teachers know that this is healthy and be able to identify healthy rough and tumble play, and to rough and tumble some with your own kids is really marvelous. But you're right on, and I'm happy for you. You've got the experience of a 20-month-old. You'll learn, get down on the floor, you'll learn more than by reading Einstein.
We have friends who are now keen on homeschooling, and I would think that a child homeschool would miss the elements of play in other children.
I think that happens, and I don't know enough about the existing literature that's now being developed on kids who are homeschooled. As you know, a lot of very, very proficient academic kids now come out of homeschooled settings. But I think the getting into a heterogeneous, mixed kind of playground situation without adults handling it is a necessary developmental part of being human. And you see this worldwide. And when that's missed, and when I take a detailed play history and I find that has been missing in an adult's life, for example, often there are ways of restoring some of that through jocular kinds of joking with friends and things which would be the adult equivalent of rough and tumble play. So my answer is, I think kids who are homeschooled, particularly if they're not in a large family, do miss out a lot. And if there is this constant adult supervision and adult expectation, that thwarts the growth and what Whitman didn't have, that repertoire. He was brilliant. He had a 140 IQ, and he was able to mimic most anything, but he didn't have any interior sense of self. It gave him a sense of interaction that enabled him to deal with the stresses that impinged on him before the tower incident. One more.
Have you done any research on integrating play into scholastic development? Because I work at a tutoring organization, and they are always trying to come up with games and methods for teaching kids while, having fun.
I haven't done anything formally, but it's a great idea. And to me, to take fun out of education is abuse. Children want to have fun and learn, and that's how they learn. So to skill and drills may be fine if they're fun. But making a game out of it, I've got a film clip that I could show some of you afterward from a teacher who teaches math in the San Francisco system, and those kids are having a ball, and they've got the highest scores, and so it works. Thank you very much.